When I moved into my new apartment, I was thrilled. The place was perfect. A spacious loft with high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and huge windows that let in plenty of natural light. It had been a while since I had my own space, and I was eager to make it feel like home. The apartment had a certain charm that drew me in from the moment I walked through the door, and I couldn't wait to settle in. One of the features I was most excited about was the large antique mirror that had been left in the living room. It was an old, ornate piece with a heavy gilded frame that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a Victorian mansion. The mirror itself was slightly tarnished, giving it a vintage look, but it was undeniably beautiful. I figured it would be a great focal point for the room and add a touch of elegance. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting everything in order. I took my time to make sure each room was just right, but I was especially focused on the living room, where the mirror took center stage. I placed it on the wall opposite the windows so it would reflect the natural light and make the space feel even bigger. Everything seemed perfect until one night, about a week after I had moved in, when I started to notice something strange. It began subtly, a flicker of movement in the mirror's reflection, a shadow that seemed to shift ever so slightly. At first, I brushed it off as a trick of the light or my own imagination, but as the days went by, the occurrences became more frequent and more unsettling. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch reading a book, I saw it again. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure in the mirror's reflection. I glanced up and saw nothing in the room behind me, but the figure was unmistakable. Tall, with broad shoulders, and wearing what looked like an old-fashioned suit. I quickly turned around, but the room was empty. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the mirror's tarnished glass or the way the shadows played in the room. I even told myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the feeling became. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when I heard a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the direction of the mirror. I lay still, straining to hear, and the scratching continued, soft, rhythmic, like someone gently scraping their nails against the glass. I got up and walked into the living room, but when I checked the mirror, there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I was on edge, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to stay up late and keep watch, hoping that whatever was causing the disturbances would reveal itself. I sat on the couch, facing the mirror, determined to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the strange occurrences. As the hours passed, I began to feel a growing sense of dread. The room was bathed in moonlight, and the mirror seemed to take on an even more sinister appearance in the dim light. Every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the curtains, felt amplified, as if the very atmosphere was charged with tension. Around midnight, I saw it again, the figure in the mirror. This time it was more distinct, more defined. The man appeared to be staring directly at me, his face partially obscured by shadows. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit with a bowler hat that obscured most of his face. I could see his eyes, dark, hollow, and unblinking, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to look away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the mirror. The figure's presence seemed to be growing stronger, more oppressive. The scratching sound returned, more insistent this time, as if the figure was trying to break free from the confines of the glass. Suddenly, the man in the mirror raised his hand, and I watched in horror as he began to move it, pressing his palm against the glass. His fingers left faint smudges on the surface, and the scratching grew louder, more frantic. I could almost hear his desperate attempts to escape. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and turned on the lights. The room was now fully illuminated, but the mirror's reflection remained unchanged. The figure was still there, still staring, still scratching. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead and knew that I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and phone and fled the apartment, not stopping until I was outside in the cold night air. I paced the sidewalk, trying to calm myself down, trying to make sense of what I had seen. My mind raced with thoughts of who or what this man was and why he was trapped in the mirror. After a few hours, I managed to gather my courage and return to the apartment. The mirror was still there, but the figure was gone. The scratching sound had stopped, and the room was eerily quiet. I decided to remove the mirror from the wall and cover it with a sheet, hoping that would put an end to the disturbances. The next day, I contacted a local antique dealer to come and take a look at the mirror. I told them everything that had happened, and they seemed intrigued. Though they didn't offer any immediate explanations, they agreed to take the mirror for evaluation and promised to let me know if they found anything unusual. As the days turned into weeks, the disturbances in the apartment ceased. I began to relax, thinking that perhaps the mirror had indeed been the source of the problem. Life slowly returned to normal, though I still couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease that had taken root in my mind. Then one evening, I received a call from the antique dealer. They told me they had examined the mirror and found nothing particularly unusual about it. There were no signs of tampering or hidden mechanisms, just an old, beautiful piece of furniture with a bit of wear and tear. They said they had cleaned it up and wanted to return it to me. I was torn. Part of me wanted to refuse to keep the mirror out of my life forever, but another part of me was curious, eager to see if the dealer had missed something or if there was an explanation for the strange occurrences. When the dealer returned the mirror, I hesitated for a moment before accepting it. They had wrapped it carefully in protective cloth, and it looked just as it had before, ornate, antique, and beautiful. I decided to hang it in a different room, hoping that the change of environment would somehow alter the mirror's effect. For the first few nights, everything seemed fine. The mirror was hung in my bedroom, and I made a conscious effort not to let it dominate my thoughts. I tried to put the past behind me and move on with my life. But then, late one night, I saw it again. The same figure, the same hollow eyes, the same feeling of dread. The mirror was now in a different room, but the figure had found me again. I could see him clearly in the reflection, his presence just as oppressive and terrifying as before. This time, the figure was more active. He moved within the mirror, his movements more pronounced, more deliberate. It was as if he was aware that I was watching him and was intent on making his presence known. I tried to turn away, to ignore the mirror, but I couldn't. The figure's gaze seemed to follow me, and the scratching sound returned, echoing through the room. I felt trapped, as if the mirror was a gateway to something dark and malevolent that was slowly encroaching on my reality. In a desperate bid to rid myself of the mirror once and for all, I decided to take it to a local thrift store, hoping that someone else would take it off my hands. I wrapped it carefully and drove to the store, feeling a sense of relief as I left it there. The store manager accepted it with no questions, and I left, hoping that I had finally escaped the nightmare. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the mirror is still out there, waiting for someone else to discover its dark secret. The image of that figure, his hollow eyes locked onto mine, haunts my dreams and waking hours, a constant reminder of the terror that lurked behind the glass. I moved to a new apartment shortly after, far away from the old place and the mirror that had so profoundly disturbed my life. But every time I pass a mirror, every time I catch my own reflection, I can't help but wonder if something is watching me from the other side, waiting for the right moment to reach through the glass and claim me. The man in the mirror remains a chilling memory, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the surface. hidden in the most ordinary of objects. Though I try to put the past behind me, I know that the fear will never truly leave me, that the reflection of the man in the mirror will always be there, lurking in the shadows of my mind. I've always been drawn to the eerie and the unknown. There's something captivating about places that are steeped in mystery, and when I heard about the abandoned hospital downtown, I felt an irresistible pull. I had been an urban explorer for years, but this was the find of a lifetime. The old St. Augustine Hospital, closed for over 2 decades, had its doors barred and windows boarded up. They said the place was cursed, but I didn't believe in curses. I believed in history, and I was eager to uncover it. The hospital was a hulking structure of crumbling brick and rusted metal. It loomed over the neighborhood like a forgotten sentinel, its facade marred with graffiti and neglect. My friends had been apprehensive, warning me against entering the place, but I was determined. Armed with a flashlight, my camera, and a sense of adventure, I ventured into the decaying building. The main entrance was locked, but it didn't take long to find a side door that had been left ajar. I slipped inside, the faint scent of mildew and decay hitting me like a physical wall. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the sound amplifying the oppressive silence that surrounded me. The lobby was a cavernous space, its once grand architecture now buried beneath layers of grime and disrepair. Faded murals adorned the walls, their colors dulled by years of exposure. A broken chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals scattered on the floor like shattered dreams. I snapped a few photos, the flash illuminating the darkness with a brief ghostly flare. I decided to explore the upper floors, believing they would hold the most interesting artifacts. The stairwell was narrow and steep, and as I climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was probably just my imagination, but every creak of the stairs and gust of wind seemed amplified, as if the building itself were alive and aware of my intrusion. The second and third floors were as expected, empty, dusty, and littered with abandoned medical equipment. Old wheelchairs lay overturned, and rusted forstands stood like silent sentinels. The remnants of the hospital's past life were everywhere, but nothing particularly noteworthy. I pressed on, feeling an increasing sense of anticipation as I reached the 4th floor. It was on the 4th floor that I first encountered something truly unsettling. The corridor was lined with old patient rooms, their doors hanging open like gaping maws. I shone my flashlight into one of the rooms, and the beam caught on an old hospital bed, its sheets tattered and stained. As I moved the light around, I noticed something strange. A series of faint hand-drawn symbols scrawled on the walls, their meanings obscure and unsettling. I snapped a few photos, the sense of unease growing stronger with each step. The 5th and 6th floors were more of the same, their hallways dark and oppressive. It was on the 7th floor that the real terror began. When I reached the 7th floor, I was surprised to find that the air was colder here, the chill biting through my jacket. The corridor was shrouded in darkness, the windows boarded up and the only light coming from my flashlight. The atmosphere was different from the other floors, heavier, more oppressive. As I ventured down the hallway, I noticed that the floor was covered in dust, undisturbed except for my footprints. The rooms on this floor were locked, their doors barricaded with debris. I tried a few handles, but they wouldn't budge. A sense of frustration mingled with my growing apprehension. I reached the end of the hallway and found a door that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found myself in what appeared to be an old administrative office. The room was filled with rusted filing cabinets and broken furniture. Papers lay scattered across the floor, and the faint smell of mold permeated the air. As I was about to leave, I heard something, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. The tapping continued, faint but persistent, and I couldn't locate its source. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was a steady, almost mechanical noise. My heart began to race, and I could feel the sweat forming on my brow. I approached the door, thinking that perhaps the tapping was coming from the hallway, but when I opened it, I found nothing out of the ordinary. The tapping stopped abruptly, and I was left in a disconcerting silence. I decided to investigate further, moving back into the office and scanning the room with my flashlight. That's when I noticed a small, unmarked door behind one of the filing cabinets. It was barely visible, its edges concealed by years of dust and neglect. My curiosity got the better of me, and I moved the cabinet aside to reveal the door. I hesitated for a moment, but my desire to uncover the mysteries of the hospital outweighed my fear. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The room was empty except for a large, old-fashioned mirror positioned against one wall. The mirror was covered in a thick layer of dust, its surface grimy and obscured. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight casting an eerie glow over its tarnished frame. I wiped away the dust with my sleeve, revealing a surprisingly clear reflection. As I looked into the mirror, I noticed something strange. My reflection was normal, but behind me, in the darkened corners of the room, there seemed to be movement. Shadows flickered and shifted, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I stepped closer to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to take shape, forming indistinct figures that moved in the periphery of my vision. I reached out to touch the glass, but before my fingers could make contact, a chilling breeze swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I tried to turn it back on. When the light finally flickered to life, the room appeared unchanged. The mirror's surface was clear, and the shadows were gone, but the sense of dread was palpable. A heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I backed away from the mirror, my instincts screaming at me to leave. The tapping sound had returned, louder and more frantic, as if something was trying to break free from within the walls. I turned and fled from the room, my flashlight casting erratic beams of light as I raced down the corridor. As I descended the stairs, the air grew warmer, the oppressive cold of the 7th floor replaced by the stale heat of the lower levels. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen, or rather, what I had almost seen. The mirror had felt alive, as if it were a gateway to something beyond human comprehension. I made my way out of the hospital, my pulse racing and my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled into the daylight, the warmth and brightness a stark contrast to the darkness of the building. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a gnawing sense of unease. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me from the hospital. My dreams were plagued by shadows and whispers, and the sense of being watched was ever present. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was all just a product of my imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. The mirror on the 7th floor had felt like a portal to something dark and ancient, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin and fragile. I had encountered something in that room, something that had left a mark on me. The mirror had not just been an object, it had been a link to a realm beyond understanding. I stopped exploring abandoned places after that. The thrill of discovery was no longer worth the risk of encountering the unknown. The memory of the seventh floor lingered in my mind, a reminder of the darkness that exists just beyond the edges of our reality. I had ventured into a place where the shadows held their secrets tight, and I had come back changed forever, haunted by the whispers and shadows of that forsaken hospital. In the end, some places are better left undisturbed, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. The seventh floor of St. Augustine Hospital was one such place, a dark chapter in my life that I would never fully understand, but which had left an indelible mark on my soul. I inherited the portrait on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. The rain had been relentless, drumming against my window pane and creating a soundtrack of melancholy. It wasn't a particularly pleasant day, but when the courier arrived with a large ornate frame wrapped in dark cloth, it was the only bright spot in an otherwise gloomy day. The portrait was from my late aunt's estate, and while I hadn't seen it before, it had apparently been in the family for generations. I was both intrigued and hesitant as I unwrapped it. The painting depicted a young woman in Edwardian attire, her gaze direct and intense. Her eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. It was unnerving but undeniably captivating. The frame was intricately carved, adorned with dark floral patterns that matched the somber mood of the portrait. I decided to hang it in my study, a room I rarely used, but thought would be an appropriate place for such an imposing piece. As I hung the portrait, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. The woman's eyes, painted with such detail, seemed almost alive. I tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination, attributing my discomfort to the weather and the unsettling nature of the inheritance. Once the portrait was securely in place, I left the study and went about my daily routine. The first night with the portrait was when the strangeness began. I was lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the study. I assumed it was just the house settling, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. I tried to ignore it, but sleep eluded me. Finally, I got up to investigate. The study was dark, illuminated only by the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. The portrait hung quietly on the wall, its gaze fixed and inscrutable. I inspected the room, finding nothing amiss. The scratching sound had ceased, but I was left with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite place. In the following days, the odd occurrences continued. I'd hear faint whispers in the study, words too garbled to understand but distinct enough to unsettle me. The portrait, while silent, seemed to become more disturbing with each passing day. The woman's expression, initially neutral, now seemed to convey a deep sorrow, and her eyes, oh, those eyes were impossibly compelling, as if they held a secret just out of reach. One evening, while working late in my study, I felt a cold draft sweep through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I glanced at the portrait, and to my horror, the woman's eyes seemed to have shifted, their expression now one of desperation and anguish. It was as if the painting itself was alive, reacting to the chill in the air. That night, I dreamt of the woman from the portrait. In the dream, she stood before me, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow. She reached out to me with a skeletal hand, her mouth moving soundlessly as if trying to convey something beyond my comprehension. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, and the dream lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over the rest of my day. Determined to get to the bottom of the portrait's mystery, I began researching its origins. I delved into old family records, hoping to uncover some clue about the woman depicted in the painting. My aunt had been a historian of sorts, documenting the family's history with meticulous detail. I hoped that her notes might shed light on the portrait's unsettling presence. After several days of searching, I found an old ledger with a detailed inventory of my aunt's possessions. Among the entries was a brief mention of the portrait of Eliza Gray, circa 1912. The note described her as a distant relative who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The description was brief but provided a crucial clue. Eliza Gray had vanished without a trace, and her disappearance had been the subject of local rumors and speculation. I sought out more information about Eliza Gray, turning to historical archives and old newspaper clippings. The more I uncovered, the more disturbing the story became. Eliza had been a young woman with a reputation for being reclusive and eccentric. She had lived alone in a large, decrepit mansion on the outskirts of town. Neighbors had reported strange occurrences around her home, and her disappearance was marked by a series of odd events that left the townspeople unsettled. One article mentioned that Eliza had been obsessed with a peculiar ritual involving the summoning of spirits. The details were vague, but the notion of her engaging in such dark practices sent shivers down my spine. The portrait, it seemed, was more than just a family heirloom. It was a remnant of something far more sinister. As I continued my research, the disturbances in the study grew more frequent and intense. The whispers became clearer, and I could almost make out words, though they were still indistinct. Shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in and out of view when I wasn't looking. The portrait appeared to change subtly. The woman's expression fluctuated between calm and anguish, as if the painting itself was alive and responding to my fear. One night, after a particularly long day of research, I sat in the study, exhausted and on edge. The room felt colder than usual, and the portrait seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when the scratching sound began again, louder and more frantic. It was coming from behind the painting, and as I approached, I noticed something disturbing. The wall behind the portrait seemed to be shifting, as if something was trying to break through. My pulse quickened, and I backed away from the painting, my mind racing. The scratching grew more intense, a relentless, maddening noise that seemed to reverberate through the room. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully removed the portrait from the wall, revealing the space behind it. The wall was solid, but I could see small claw-like scratches etched into the surface, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. In a panic, I decided to remove the portrait from the study entirely. I couldn't bear to keep it in my home any longer, but as I tried to take it down, I felt a cold, unseen force pushing back against me. The painting seemed to resist, as if it were tethered to something beyond my comprehension. I managed to dislodge it, and with trembling hands, I wrapped it up and placed it in the attic, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. The disturbances ceased after the portrait was removed. The whispers stopped, and the shadows seemed to retreat. However, the sense of dread lingered, a reminder of the dark presence that had once haunted my study. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that had been awakened by the portrait's presence. In the days that followed, I continued my research into Eliza Gray, hoping to find some resolution to the unsettling mystery. The more I learned, the more I realized that the portrait was not just a painting but a vessel for something dark and malevolent. Eliza's story was one of obsession and madness, and it seemed that the portrait had become a conduit for the malevolent forces she had once summoned. I never returned the portrait to my home. It remains in the attic, hidden away and untouched. I can't bring myself to destroy it, but I can't forget the sense of malevolence it brought into my life. The portrait of Eliza Gray is a dark chapter in my life, a reminder of the dangers of delving into the unknown and the price of uncovering secrets better left buried. In the end, I learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved and some artifacts should never be disturbed. The portrait was more than just a family heirloom. It was a link to something dark and dangerous, a reminder that there are forces beyond our understanding lurking just beneath the surface of our reality.